morning and welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Forum. Now, I say good morning because it's out of habit. For 17 years, we've always said good morning because our origins were at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library, a big brick and mortar building in Oakland. But now we are on Zoom, so I say good morning just out of habit because I know many of you are not in different time zones. In fact, our speaker it is good afternoon for him. And my name is Roger Harris, and I'm with the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, the ICSS. And we are the people that have been putting on these weekly programs for over a decade and a half. And I'm on the program committee of the ICSS. To find out more about our programs, go to our website, icssmarx.org. And on the website, you can find out more about programs, recordings of past programs, descriptions of past programs, and yes, a place to donate because we do have some expenses and we much appreciate people donating to the programs. And so I wanted to announce who our speaker is today. It's John Perry, who is in Nicaragua. And the program today is about Latin America resists Trump, deportations, drugs, and excuse me, and economic warfare. And from our point of view, the big difference between Donald Trump and his predecessors is that the current CEO of the empire exposes naked imperialism. So if there's any upside to the Trump ascendancy, it's the fact that the essence of U.S. imperialism is becoming more and more evident to people throughout the world. And at this particular program, we want to talk about what we're seeing from the view of Latin America. And their view of what's happening, of course, is very different from the view that we hear in the press. Our speaker is uniquely qualified to speak about that. John Perry is originally from the UK, but he's now a naturalized Nicaraguan citizen. He's been living there for a long time. And he's really one of the really distinguished, in my opinion, most distinguished journalists on the left. His work has appeared in London Review of Books, Grayzone, Fair, and many other publications. So from the beautiful land of lakes and volcanoes, John, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. That's a very generous introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I hope that works. We're going to talk about, as Roger said, we're going to talk about the implications of Trump being back in power and how will his policies work out in Latin America and the Caribbean. And obviously, I'm going to be very, very speculative about this. It's difficult to say with any certainty what's going to happen, but I think we can see some trends that are beginning to emerge. And I thought I'd start off by talking about the different characters involved as far as Trump is concerned with Latin America. And of course, I have to start with Elon Musk, who has taken some action that's relevant to Latin America already, because he stopped the operation of USAID, which he described as a criminal organization. And in relation to Latin America, there's quite a lot of truth in that assertion. Because it's being used for regime change activities throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, said in response to Musk, "Take your money with you, it's poison." And it's interesting that already the so-called independent media in Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and elsewhere have been complaining that the disappearance of the money from USAID threatens their so-called independence and indeed their existence. And it's also put the opposition alliance in Venezuela into crisis because they've run out of money too. And you could read more about that in some of the links that I'll show at the bottom of the pages. I think we'll probably circulate the presentation afterwards, and there'll be links there where you can look at more on some of these topics. The second person, of course, is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He's a Cuban gusano, a Cuban worm. That's to say, a former Cuban who has now turned against the revolution in Cuba. In fact, his family left Cuba before the revolution, although he tends to elide over that fact. He's an ardent advocate of sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. He describes them as illegitimate regimes, which are enemies of humanity. And rather worryingly, he pointed out, I think when he was in Panama, that the Trump administration was going to focus on Latin America because of the missed opportunities and neglected partners that it has in the region, when we'll come back to that. And the third of the president's men I wanted to mention, who hasn't been very prominent so far, is Mauricio Claver Carón, who's the disgraced former head of the Inter-American Development Bank. And he's one of the active architects of the Juan Guaido coup attempt in Venezuela. And in fact, he's seen here with Guaido just after he got some money from US aid for Guaido. And as we know, Guaido has spent tens of millions of US aid. And then the fourth character, possibly a slightly more hopeful one, is Richard Grenell, who is Trump's special envoy to Venezuela and previously was an ambassador to Germany. Indeed, he's better than Elliot Abrahams, who held this post in the last Trump administration. He's thought to be a diplomat rather than a hawk, and he went to visit Nicolas Maduro in Caracas and had negotiated the release of prisoners who'd entered Venezuela in an attempt to depose Maduro, US prisoners. And as a result of that meeting, Maduro agreed to the return of Venezuelan migrants. And then the fifth of the men on the president's side is Admiral Alvin Hoseley. He's the commander of Southcom, the division of the US military that operates in the Western Hemisphere. And he sees the full range of threats operating in Latin America from China, Russia, Iran, and elsewhere. He follows very much the same line as his recent predecessor, Laura Richardson, who just not long ago left as commander of Southcom. He's got a formidable lineup of 76 military bases in Latin America and the Caribbean, which he's responsible for. And he sees US policy as preventing Latin America from being part of a multipolar world. And Roger, with our friend Francisco Dominguez, wrote about him very recently. It's a link there on that slide. Then I thought I'd turn to just reflecting on some of the electoral issues coming up or having recently passed in Latin America, and attempting to divide this between the Latin America left, although that's quite a hazy term, and the Latin America right, which is perhaps more easy to define. Well, on the left, at the present time, we have two relatively recently elected presidents, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Bolivia and Honduras both have elections this year. Colombia and Brazil have elections in 2026. Nicaragua's elections will now be in 2027. And as people probably know, Cuba doesn't have direct elections for the presidency, but it does have an internal electoral system as well. On the center left, Yamandú Orsi has just taken the Uruguayan presidency this week. He's just ascended to the presidency, as it were, this week on behalf of the Open Front, the Frente Amplio in Uruguay. And Gabriel Boric, who's been the rather controversial and not very left-wing president of Chile is facing election in November, and his party is almost certain to lose it. I borrowed for these two slides this rather dubious map by James Bosworth. So don't pay too much attention to the legend on the map, but it's a useful guide to when elections are taking place. And on the right, we have several recently elected governments. Nayib Bukele won in El Salvador in 2024, as did Jose Raul Mulino in Panama. Bernardo Arevalo won in Guatemala. You might categorize him as more progressive than some of the other right-wing presidents. Javier Milei took office in December 2023 and is causing economic chaos in Argentina. Santiago Peña was elected in Paraguay in 2022. And some of the right-wingers face imminent elections, though Daniel Noboa tied in the second round election in Ecuador and faces a new round of elections in April. Dina Boluarte, who took power in a coup in Peru, faces elections in 2026. And Rodrigo Chavez in Costa Rica faces election in 2026. So what I'll do is talk a little bit about some of those countries and what's the state of the left in those countries. Looking first at what I've called the mid-Andean countries, which all face elections relatively soon. Perhaps the most interesting is in Ecuador, where Daniel Noboa, who's from Ecuador's richest family, almost tied with the leftist candidate, Luisa Gonzalez, who inherits Rafael Correa's Citizens' Revolution movement. So there will be a very close runoff on April the 13th. And the key players in the runoff are probably the previous candidates for the indigenous parties, who may decide which of the two wins on April the 13th. Noboa seems to have retained popularity, even though he's pursued very hardline policies, similar to Bukele's in El Salvador, in tackling crime. Ecuador has become the world's sixth most violent country under his watch, having been one of the safest countries under the presidency of Rafael Correa. And you can read more about the election there in an interesting article by Francisco Dominguez that I've referred to on the slide. In Bolivia, the left is split. Luisa Arce from the MAS will stand for election again later this year. But Evo Morales, the heroic figure originally from the MAS, has now set up his own party. And so the left is split, and that may cost them power in the coming elections. As I mentioned, Peru, Boluarte must stand down in 2026. I think a feature of all of these Andean elections, even more than the other elections in Latin America, is the likelihood of US intervention. Clearly, the US and the Organization of American States drove Evo from power in Bolivia in 2019. And those of you who've read Philip Agee's now quite old book, Inside the Company, will remember how active the CIA were in Ecuador. And I don't think there's any reason to doubt that they're still just as active. Well, looking at the position in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum is enjoying enormous popularity. Polls suggest more than 80% of Mexicans support her, which is good. She's said to have asserted Mexican sovereignty in the face of threats from Trump, but it seems that she hasn't yet fended off the tariffs, having initially appeared to have done so. In response to Trump's allegations that Mexico is feeding the drugs trade into the US, she's focused on the arms trafficking into Mexico from the US, and 74% of arms in Mexico come from the US, and has pointed out that the drug trade is as much to blame within the US as outside the US, because it's in the United States where the drugs are consumed. but she has recently agreed to extradite drug suspects to the US. So there's a kind of delicate balance there in negotiations between Mexico and the new Trump administration. Colombia is in some chaos really on the left. Petro's party faces elections in 2026. He recently said, after a rather chaotic televised cabinet meeting, that he was wrong to believe that he could make a revolution by governing. And he's changed a lot of his cabinet members. He seems to have fallen out with his indigenous vice president. And he's also facing renewed violence in the Catatumbo region of Colombia. So things aren't going well for the left in Colombia at the moment. In Central America, most of the right-wing regimes have really lined up to support Trump. In El Salvador, Bukele, as you probably know, offered to take US convicts into his prisons. All of the right-wing governments have agreed to receive migrants deported from the US. And in fact, in Costa Rica and Panama, migrants have been arriving from countries where they can't be extradited to, like Afghanistan. And there's considerable confusion amongst these poor migrants who are now stuck in a country which they didn't want to be in, as to what will happen to them next. And I think, we're going to see more of that confusion and chaos as Trump's migration policies develop further. In Panama, there was this extraordinary encounter between Marco Rubio and the president, Jose Raul Mulino, after Trump declared that he wanted to take over, or he's going to take over, the Panama Canal that should never have been ceded to Panama by Jimmy Carter in the first place. Mulino was in rather an awkward position because he'd been patronizing Trump by saying that he shouldn't think that the US southern border is in Mexico. Really, it's in Panama, in the Darien. And he wanted US support for hardening the border in Darien. But it was not exactly the right phraseology to say that the US southern border runs through Panama, just at the point where Trump was setting his eyes on the Panama Canal. In response to these threats, Mulino has taken Panama out of the China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's also auditing Chinese control of 2 ports, one at either end of the canal. And I suppose waiting on next steps by Trump and Rubio, but also looking at Panamanian response to this, because the Panamanians are very worried that Mulino will cave into Trump in some way, and they're not very keen on losing their canal. Then we have another critical situation for the left in Honduras, where Xiomara Castro is in power, but her party faces elections at the end of this year. As people will recall, Xiomara Castro is the wife of Mel Zelaya, who was deposed in a US-supported coup in 2009. She wrested control from the neocon Liberal Party, eventually, the very corrupt Liberal Party, whose former president is now in a New York prison. But she's facing continuous threats from the US, despite, or maybe because of the investment which she's putting into public services and reducing poverty in Honduras. She has the misfortune of having as US ambassador Laura Dogu, who was previously in Nicaragua and orchestrated the coup attempts here in 2018. And she's getting the elites in Honduras to work against the government. They require no encouragement to do that, of course. She's recently been forced into a volte-face, Xiomara that is, on an extradition treaty with the US, which she said that she would revoke, but has now reinstated. And she faces a huge threat if migrants begin to return from the US, because that will jeopardize her anti-poverty programs and also, of course, lead to potentially to huge loss of remittances being sent from the US to Honduras. There's a very visible threat in the largest US military base in Central America at Palmarola. And she's making attempts to widen Honduras's contacts with the rest of the world and links with the rest of the world. As our foreign minister recently said, countries like Honduras will have to find an alternative to relations with the US. We know that Marco Rubio has already taken action against Cuba. He's restored, or he and Trump have restored Cuba's categorization, farcical categorization as a state sponsor of terrorism. He's been blaming Cuba for migration. He's suspended or changed rules which have led to Western Union suspending remittances being sent to Cuba, which is very damaging for Cuban families, of course. The Trump administration will allow new property claims by those who left after the revolution, those claims having been suspended for many years. They're planning sanctions against the organizers of Cuba's medical brigades on the grounds that this involves human trafficking, which again is farcical. And there are suggestions that they may end all US travel to Cuba. And then Venezuela, I've mentioned the visit by Grenell, which appeared to be successful. He mentioned almost in passing that the new government in Washington was not interested in regime change. So it seemed like the US had flirtation with recognizing Edmundo Gonzalez as the real president of Venezuela has fallen by the wayside. Maduro's position is certainly stronger after his recent inauguration in January. The economy is growing, and he's now recognized by more Latin American governments. But I think there's a big worry about the planned withdrawal of the waiver by which Chevron imports oil from Venezuela, because that's very important to Venezuela's economy. But I think there's rather a confused situation there that we're waiting to see how it pans out. I thought I'd finish by talking a little bit in slightly more detail about Nicaragua. And I begin by mentioning the role of US aid, because that's topical given Musk's attack on US aid in Washington. Well, in Nicaragua, US aid spent $315 million, possibly more, this is what we know, on regime change activities in the 7 years from 2014, which of course encompassed the coup attempt in 2018. Most of this money went to big US consultancies or to rich Nicaraguan media owners. And the USA then launched a specific $5 million program to undermine Nicaragua's 2021 elections when Daniel Ortega was returned to power. And of course, in Latin America, but particularly in Nicaragua, hardly any of this money spent by US aid actually benefits ordinary Nicaraguans. And there's an article about that at the bottom of the page as well. I thought I'd just give an example of what happened to US aid money and how this fed the violence in Nicaragua. There's an organization called, or there was, called the Movimiento Campesino, the rural workers movement, which received over $400,000 from the US. And its leader was a man called Medardo Marena. And the Movimiento Campesino was responsible for some of the most violent roadblocks in central and eastern Nicaragua in the period April to July 2018, and attacked several police stations. And the worst and most violent of these attacks was in a small town called Morito on July the 12th, where, as a result of which 5 people died, including 4 police officers, and 9 police officers, all of the remaining police officers in the small police station were taken away, beaten, and later returned in a prisoner exchange. Immediately the violence took place, there were right-wing media there on the spot who clearly knew what was about to happen, but there weren't any right-wing opposition victims. So they publicised this photo as if somebody had been shot in the attack on the police station. In fact, the way they portrayed it was the police attacked a peaceful demonstration, and this was one of the victims. But this photo actually comes from the coup in Honduras in 2009, has nothing to do with Nicaragua in 2018. The BBC, as did the corporate media in the US and in the rest of Europe, simply picked up that this peaceful protest had been attacked by the police. And when Medardo Moreno was arrested with his accomplice Pedro Mena, and they were later sentenced, the BBC rather portrayed this as a gross misjustice, despite the fact that they were guilty of organising this horrendous armed protest in which 200 people carried weapons that were concealed until they arrived at the police station in this small town. Nevertheless, despite being arrested and imprisoned, Moreno was released in the amnesty a year later in July 2019, as were all of the people who'd been arrested for violence, and including murder and torture during 2018. And here he is in 2020 trying to organise the opposition in my own town in Masaya. And there he is again in, I think it's 2023, in speaking at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, denouncing human rights violations in Nicaragua. And he's there with 4 other people, all of whom are beneficiaries of US aid and probably continue to be beneficiaries of US government finance, because Juan Sebastian Chamorro on the left there sees himself as the next president of Nicaragua, unless, of course, his rival, Maradiaga, Felix Maradiaga in the center, becomes the opposition candidate at some stage. So that was just a little reflection on the impact of US aid. And I'll just say a few words about the current state of Nicaragua and the threats that it's facing at the moment with the change of administration in Washington. The country's recovered from its stability economically and socially after the 2018 coup attempt. And of course, it was hit, as were other countries, by the pandemic in 2020. But since 2021, it's been the fastest growing economy in Central America. Inward investment has been growing. Tourism has been growing back to the levels that it's achieved in 2017. And the government has been investing massively in public services, in health centres, hospitals, schools, technical education, university education, and in poverty reduction on a really massive scale. And therefore, of course, it's a strategic threat to the United States, and it's been a strategic threat since the first Trump administration. But under the new one, it faces continuing or new threats. There are already sanctions on international investment in Nicaragua, so it relies for international loans on the regional bank, CABEI, and on bilateral loans. And there have been attacks on CABEI and declarations by Rubio that he wants CABEI to stop funding Nicaragua. Nicaragua is under threat of removal from the regional trade treaty, which it has with the US, which is quite a significant threat because the US is still its biggest trading partner. It's under threat of sanctions because, at least until recently, migrants were able to pass through Nicaragua using flights to Nicaragua without needing visas. And that was said by the Biden administration to constitute human trafficking. And given Nicaragua's active support for Palestine, it's become the focus of attention by the Israeli ambassador in Costa Rica, who's accused Nicaragua of providing a terrorist base for Hamas. But quite what Hamas would do with a terrorist base in Nicaragua is rather unclear. But if you want to read more about those threats, again, there's a link to an article there. So to finish, I think I've run over my time a little bit. I wanted to just come back to a sort of general question about multipolarity, Trump, and where Latin America fits in this possibly new multipolar world. We're in a situation where trade between Latin America and China has grown enormously, now worth over $500 billion annually. Many countries, not just Nicaragua, are in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Brazil has got strong partnerships with China. Brazil is one of the founders of the BRICS movement, which is now being joined by Bolivia and Cuba. There are several other Latin American countries that want to join BRICS, but BRICS is seen as a threat by Trump, who wants to revive the Monroe Doctrine. Does that mean that Latin America is going to find its engagement with multipolarity to be more complicated than it might have been under Biden? And we return to that phrase of that rather sinister phrase of Marco Rubio's, that there are missed opportunities and neglected partners in Latin America, which he's going to turn his attention to. So I think I'll stop there and hand over to Roger and stop sharing my screen and look forward to hearing questions or viewpoints.
Thank you very much, John, and excellent presentation, very good slides.